And welcome back. Let's go ahead and jump right in and graph this function right where we left off. So we got y equals 3 cosine of 2x. Okay, let me go ahead and do this in a different color to kind of separate. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to find what the amplitude is and what the midline is. Want to find the length of a cycle, otherwise known as the period, and that should help us figure out what the scale should be. Okay, so our amplitude, absolute value of A, that would be 3. Okay, in the midline, well, we haven't moved up or down at all because there's no addition or subtraction outside, so it's still at y equals 0. So what that means is I need to go 3 above the midline of 0 and 3 below the midline of 0. So my maximum is going to occur at 3, and my minimum is going to occur at -3. Okay, now for the period, once again, it's 2 pi over the absolute value of b, which in this case is 2, and 2 pi over 2 leaves us with just pi, so it's going to take a length of pi to complete one cycle. And to figure out the scale, we can go ahead and divide pi by 4 to get pi over 4. So our scale is going to be pi over 4. So 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, that reduces a pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and 4 pi over 4, which reduces to pi. Okay, and now we can go ahead and graph. Now sine started at the midline, cosine starts at the maximum. So I'm starting all the way up at the maximum at 3. Okay, and once you're at that maximum, only way to go is down. So we go down the amplitude of 3 to our midline of 0, down another 3 to our minimum of -3, and once we're at the minimum, we can only go up 3 to the midline, and up 3 to the maximum. So this would end up being our graph for cosine, something like that. All right, that would end up being our graph for this particular cosine function. And just like with sine, this actually continues in each direction. If I wanted to, I can continue this in either direction. Okay, I can continue this in either direction. You don't need to, but just know that it definitely wouldn't be wrong. And some people do like to see 2 full cycles. I'm fine with 1. I don't really care as long as I know that you can do it. Okay? Let's go ahead and check out another one. So let's go ahead and try something like, and I'm actually going to put multiple transformations in this one. So let's do something like y equals -2 cosine 1/4 x plus 1. If you want to try this one out, feel free to. I'm going to go ahead and run through it though. So I'm going to go ahead and first find what the amplitude and midline are. Now the amplitude, absolute value of A, which is 2. Now remember, that negative here, that negative just means it's reflected over the x-axis. Reflected over the x-axis. Now, cosine normally starts at the maximum. But since it's been reflected over the x-axis, since it's negative, it's going to start at the minimum. Okay, it's going to start at the minimum. Okay, just like with sine, if it was reflected, we went down to the minimum right away. With cosine, if it's reflected, we start at the minimum right away. Okay, so amplitude is 2, starting at the minimum. The midline, though, we have been shifted up 1, which means it's going to be y equals 1. Okay, so that can kind of help me figure out the start of our graph. So the midline is at 1, and I always like to plot it with just a dashed line. You don't need to. And now I'm going to use the amplitude to figure out the rest of the scale. Well, I need to go up 2 to hit the maximum, and I need to go down 2 to hit the minimum. So my maximum is going to be at 3 because that's 2 above 1, and my minimum is going to be at -1 because that's 2 below 1. Okay, now to figure out the period and the scale for x. Okay, now the period is always for sine and cosine 2 pi over the absolute value of b, which is 1/4. And remember, dividing by 1/4 is the same as multiplying by 4, so that's going to become 8 pi, which means the scale, always take the period divided by 4, is 2 pi. So I add 2 pi to 0 to get 2 pi. I add another 2 pi to get 4 pi. Add another 2 pi to get 6 pi. Add another 2 pi to get 8 pi. Okay, and now we can go ahead and graph. Now remember, this is reflected, so it's starting at the minimum, which is at -1. And then I go up 2, the amplitude is 2, I go up 2 to hit the midline, up 2 to hit the maximum, down 2 to hit the midline, and down 2 to hit the minimum, okay? And then I'm going to go ahead and connect this with a nice curve, as nice as I can, that is. Never want to make it jagged, okay? And this would end up being our graph. So that's how we can graph cosine with amplitude, period, and phase shift, okay? So it's pretty much identical to graphing sine, the way we find all the information, the way we use all the information. The only difference is the pattern. Sine starts at the midline and goes up. Cosine starts at the maximum, goes down. And remember, that's the exact opposite for both if it is reflected, okay? So make sure you're practicing finding all this information and graphing these by hand, okay? In the next couple of videos, maybe I'll take a look at a couple of phase shifts, and then I will also talk about graphs of tangent. So stay tuned.